The rain was a steady drumbeat against the windows of Elias Hawke's office. The dim glow of a desk lamp lit the stacks of books and papers strewn across his cluttered desk, the kind of mess a historian of his caliber could never quite bring himself to tidy. He had spent years studying time, the great river of human history that always flowed in one direction, the past forever behind them and the future forever ahead. Or, at least, that's how things had been until now. Elias had always prided himself on his ability to make sense of history. Facts were facts, dates were dates, and events followed a logical sequence. That's how history worked. But today was different. His latest research project, one he had been chasing for over a year, had suddenly unraveled into something altogether impossible. Something far beyond his expertise. A knock echoed from the hallway. It was brief, polite. But Elias didn't look up from the notes in front of him. He had just read through them for the 10th time and was still no closer to an answer. "Dr. Hawke," a voice called, muffled through the door. "We need you in the lab. It's urgent." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Another interruption. "In a minute," he called back, but the door opened anyway. A woman in a rumpled lab coat stepped inside. She was young, mid-30s at most, with short, dark hair and an expression that suggested she had spent far too much time with quantum equations to worry about how she looked. Dr. Lena Tran, one of the lead physicists at MIT's experimental physics department, was both brilliant and infuriatingly pragmatic. "This really can't wait," she said, her voice flat with impatience. "We've got a serious anomaly on our hands, and I need you to see it for yourself." Elias didn't move. "Lena, I'm working on something right now. I've got a timeline here, you know, the whole history of the 20th century rewritten by some quantum event. I've been trying to figure out how." "Later, Hawke," she interrupted. "There's no time. Just come with me." The irritation in her voice broke through his concentration. He stood, reluctantly, and followed her down the narrow hallway, through the maze of research rooms, and into the heart of the lab, a sterile, high-tech space that looked like something out of a science fiction film. In the center of the room stood a strange machine. The quantum pulse device, they called it. A massive, humming machine of wires, blinking lights, and what looked like a glass tube holding a swirling blue orb. "What is this?" Elias asked, his voice betraying both curiosity and confusion. Lena's eyes glinted with a mix of excitement and frustration. "You're about to find out. We think the device has activated on its own. Something's wrong with time." Elias walked up to the device, peering at the orb. It was mesmerizing, a swirling vortex of light that seemed to bend the air around it. He had read about the quantum pulse theory, of course, the idea that quantum fields could, under certain circumstances, disrupt the fabric of time itself. But no one had ever expected to see it happen. No one had expected it to be this real. Suddenly, the orb flickered. Elias took a step back, instinctively. And then, before he could blink, a figure appeared from nowhere. A man, standing in the middle of the lab, as if he had just materialized from thin air. He wore a military-style coat, a high-collared garment that looked anachronistic, as if it belonged to the early 19th century. Elias froze. The man's features were sharp, angular, his eyes intense, his hair dark and swept back with a calculated precision. He looked out of place, absurdly out of place, standing there in the midst of the modern lab. "Where am I?" the man demanded, his voice thick with an accent Elias couldn't place. "Who are you people?" Lena swore under her breath. "It's happening," she muttered. "This isn't just a glitch in the system. This is a time anomaly." The man Napoleon Bonaparte looked around in confusion. He reached up, adjusting his coat with a look of obvious discomfort. "This is not right," he said, his tone growing more insistent. "I was supposed to be leading my troops into battle. What is this place?" Elias blinked. "Napoleon?" The man looked at him sharply, as if considering him for the first time. "Ah, You speak my language," he said with a sudden gleam of recognition. "But you, sir, are no soldier. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. Where is my army? Where are my plans?" Elias couldn't believe it. This wasn't a hallucination. This was impossible. The great Napoleon was standing in front of him, in the middle of a 21st-century physics lab, looking as though he had just stepped out of the pages of a history book. "This is... I don't know what's happening," Elias said slowly, his mind racing to catch up. "You're supposed to be dead. You were exiled to St. Helena after Waterloo." Napoleon blinked, clearly confused. "Exiled? You're telling me I'm dead? That's impossible." At that moment, the machine began to hum louder, its light intensifying. Napoleon took a step back, his eyes narrowing as the room around him shimmered, as if reality itself were bending and warping. "What is this sorcery?" he demanded. "It's not sorcery," Lena said firmly, moving toward the control panel. "This is science. And it's about to get a lot stranger." Elias's mind was still reeling as he followed Lena out of the lab. Napoleon Bonaparte was real. Standing in front of them. Something had gone wrong with time. They weren't just dealing with a small glitch. They were staring at the collapse of time itself. Elias had seen his share of strange things in history, but nothing like this. Lena was already speaking to the other scientists in the control room, her voice sharp with urgency. "The quantum pulse is interfering with the timeline. History's been rewritten, and we need to figure out how far it's gone before things get even worse." "How bad are we talking here?" Elias asked, still processing. "Bad enough that we have no idea what's going to happen next," Lena said, not looking up. "Napoleon was never supposed to appear here. He was supposed to be dead and buried, not wherever the hell we are right now. The virus, the quantum pulse, it's distorting history, Elias. Past, present, and future are bleeding together. And if we don't stop it, everything we know could be erased." Elias's mind spun. The implications of what she was saying were staggering. History, his life's work, was being rewritten by a virus? A quantum virus that could distort time itself? "This is insane," he murmured. "How do we fix it?" Lena looked him in the eye, her expression grave. "That's why I brought you in. You're a historian. You can help us trace the disruptions. Together, we can figure out where this began and how to reverse it." The weight of the responsibility settled on Elias's shoulders. For years, he had studied history. But this was something else entirely. He wasn't just observing history anymore. He was now part of it. Days later, Elias found himself standing in front of the quantum pulse machine again. This time, it wasn't just a theory anymore. They were going to use it to jump through time. Lena had assured him that they could track the changes in the timeline, pinpoint where things had gone wrong. But Elias wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Lena. "We don't have a choice," she replied. "We need to go to the source of the distortion." Elias hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting from the machine to the rest of the team. They were all silent, their faces drawn and tense. This was no longer just a scientific experiment. It was a race against time itself. "Ready?" Lena asked, pressing a button on the machine. Elias nodded. "Let's go." And with that, the world around him collapsed into a blur of light. The first jump was disorienting. One moment, Elias was standing in the lab. The next, he was somewhere else entirely. The air smelled different. The sky was darker, filled with thick clouds. He looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. He was standing in the middle of what looked like a bustling 1940s street. A parade of soldiers marched past him, their uniforms strange but familiar. For a moment, he thought he was in Paris during World War II, but something was off. "Wait a second. Elias muttered. This isn't right. Elias blinked, his senses assaulted by the sudden shift in atmosphere. He was no longer in the lab or the sterile, modern world he had grown accustomed to. Instead, he stood in a cobblestone street, the air heavy with the scent of burning wood and oil. A banner hung overhead, emblazoned with strange symbols he couldn't quite read, fluttering in the wind. "Where the hell are we?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the sounds of marching soldiers and clanging metal. The soldiers moved in tight formation, their boots pounding against the street as they marched past Elias, seemingly oblivious to his presence. The uniforms were old-fashioned but well-worn, their brass buttons catching the dim light of the street lamps. The streets themselves were crowded, but not with the kind of modern bustle Elias was used to. People moved quickly, nervously, their faces grim as they watched the soldiers pass. "Is this World War II?" Elias asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene. It felt like Paris, but there was something wrong. The architecture was too old, the air too thick with tension. Lena appeared beside him, her face pale under the moonlight. "No," she said, her voice low. "This isn't 1940s Paris. This is something else." Elias turned to look at her, his heart racing. "What do you mean? Where are we?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied the scene, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I think we've jumped further back. This isn't just any World War II timeline. It's a version of the war that never ended. This is an alternate timeline." Elias's mind spun. A version of the war that never ended? How was that even possible? The streets were filled with propaganda posters, strange symbols that didn't resemble any Nazi insignia Elias was familiar with. The flags were different too, their designs unfamiliar. As Elias scanned the streets again, his gaze fell on a group of civilians huddled in a doorway, whispering anxiously. One of them was holding a newspaper, the headline written in a language Elias couldn't understand. "Wait, wait," Lena whispered, scanning the same group. "Look at that paper. I think it's in ancient Greek." Elias felt his stomach drop. Ancient Greek? But that's impossible. We're not even supposed to be in this timeline. Lena shook her head, a mix of dread and fascination in her eyes. "I think we're seeing history fractured. Pieces of different times coming together in one moment." She paused. "The quantum pulse is destabilizing history. It's tearing things apart." Elias's mind raced as he tried to wrap his head around the enormity of what Lena was saying. The timeline was no longer linear, no longer steady. History wasn't fixed, it was mutable, chaotic like a kaleidoscope of fractured moments. They weren't in the past, not entirely. They weren't in the present either. And they weren't in the future either. "What do we do now?" Elias asked, trying to stay calm despite the storm of confusion swirling inside his head. Lena was silent for a moment, then, with a determined look in her eyes, she pointed toward a building at the far end of the street. "That's the government office. If we can get inside, we can find out what's going on. Maybe we can learn where the fracture started." Elias nodded, swallowing hard. "All right. Let's move." They moved quickly, slipping through the crowds and staying in the shadows. The soldiers didn't seem to notice them, their attention focused on their patrols. As they neared the building, Elias caught sight of something that made him stop in his tracks, a poster on the wall, the colors faded by time but still legible. It was a propaganda poster, showing a dark-haired man with sharp features, his eyes cold and calculating. The text beneath it read, "We will not be defeated. The new empire rises." Elias's heart skipped a beat. The man on the poster looked strikingly familiar, but he couldn't place where he'd seen him before. Lena noticed his hesitation. "What's wrong?" Elias tore his gaze away from the poster and shook his head. I don't know. That face. I feel like I've seen it before." But where? Lena pulled him gently toward the entrance of the building. We'll figure it out later. Let's get inside and see if we can make sense of all this. The door opened with a creak, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with worn carpets and faded paintings. They moved swiftly through the corridor, until they reached a set of double doors at the end. Lena pushed them open, and they stepped into a large office, where a group of men in dark suits stood around a desk, arguing heatedly. The men looked up as they entered, their eyes sharp, but their faces unreadable. They didn't seem surprised by the intrusion, almost as if they'd been expecting it. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, with a square jaw and dark, penetrating eyes. He wore a black uniform with silver insignia that Elias didn't recognize. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said coldly, his voice deep and authoritative. Elias opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Lena stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We know about the fracture," she said. "We're trying to understand what's happening. This isn't just a glitch in the timeline. Something's causing the past, present, and future to bleed together." The man's expression flickered with a brief moment of surprise, then quickly returned to his unreadable mask. "You're correct," he said slowly. "The time fracture is real. But you're too late. The damage has already been done." "Too late?" Elias repeated. "What do you mean?" The man turned to the others in the room, nodding. They all fell silent, as if awaiting some unspoken cue. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low but urgent. "The fracture didn't start here," he said. "It started somewhere else. Somewhere far worse. We've been trying to control it, to fix it, but it's out of control. The very fabric of reality is starting to unravel. You need to leave. Now." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "Where did it start?" he demanded. "Where is this coming from?" The man's eyes flicked briefly to the poster on the wall, the one with the face Elias had seen earlier. Then, he turned back to them, his gaze sharp and cold. "Napoleon," he said. "It's all connected to him." Elias's stomach twisted. "Napoleon? The man who had appeared in the lab? What do you mean?" Lena asked, her voice tight. The man stepped back, as if weighing his words carefully. "Napoleon Bonaparte was never meant to be part of this timeline. But the quantum pulse, when it first activated it, brought him here. And since then, history has been collapsing. We don't know how to stop it. The very laws of time are being rewritten." Elias felt a sense of urgency, a rising panic. "We have to stop it. We have to fix it." The man's gaze hardened. "You can try. But there's no going back. Not now." With those words, the room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with tension. Elias and Lena exchanged a look, both of them realizing that they had just taken their first step into a far deeper mystery than they had ever imagined. And they were about to plunge headfirst into the chaos of time itself, a chaos that might never be repaired. Elias's mind was racing, the tension in the room palpable. Napoleon. The quantum pulse. History unraveling. It was all too much to take in, but the man in the dark uniform had made it clear this wasn't just some theoretical problem anymore. It was a catastrophe. And they had to stop it. The weight of the words hung in the air as the man turned away from them, his back now to Elias and Lena, his hands folded tightly behind his back. The other men in the room were silent, their eyes unreadable, as though they were waiting for something. Waiting for a decision, or perhaps waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Elias swallowed hard. "What do we do next?" The man in the uniform didn't respond immediately. He walked over to a map on the wall, gesturing vaguely at the numerous points marked in red. "The fractures are spreading," he said. "Each disruption in the timeline is like a small crack in a dam. Some of these fractures have already merged, parts of history have already bled together. The war you saw on the streets? That's one of the fractures. You were in the 1940s, but not ours. That's a timeline where World War II never ended. Where Napoleon never died. But Napoleon did die, Lena interrupted, her voice sharp. He was exiled to St. Helena. You can't just rewrite history like that. Not anymore, the man said, turning slowly to face them. The pulse changed everything. Everything you thought you knew about time, about history, no longer applies. The quantum virus doesn't just distort time, it destroys it. It's rewriting the entire past, present, and future at will. Elias felt his head spin. This is insane. What does it have to do with Napoleon? The man's lips pressed into a thin line. It's all connected. Napoleon is the anchor. He should have been erased from history. But instead, the pulse pulled him into this fractured timeline. And now, he's starting to affect the other timelines as well. If we don't fix it soon, the fractures will merge completely. There won't be a past or future anymore. There will just be chaos. Elias took a step forward, his pulse quickening. And what does that mean for us? For the world? For history? Exactly what I just said, the man said coldly. The world as you know it is being unmade. Lena turned to Elias, her face pale but determined. We need to find out where the pulse started, Elias. We need to find the source of the fracture and fix it. But to do that, we'll need to jump through more of these fractured timelines. We might have to go into places we don't understand, places where time isn't what we think it is. Elias nodded grimly, his mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. So, where do we go first? The man in the uniform eyed them for a moment, then gestured to a chair at the large oak desk. We'll help you. But you have to understand this, once you leave this room, there's no coming back to the timeline you knew. Whatever you find out there, whatever you do, it will be irreversible. History, as you knew it, will be gone. Elias felt a deep pang in his chest. What kind of world would they return to, if they succeeded? What if they couldn't fix it? We understand, he said, the words sounding hollow in his ears. But there was no choice. He was already in this. They were already in this. And if they didn't act, history itself could be lost. Lena was already moving toward the door. We don't have time to waste. We'll take the machine to the next fracture point. Elias glanced back at the man one last time. You'll keep tracking the anomalies, right? Let us know if there's another breach. The man gave a stiff nod, his face unreadable. You're on your own now. Good luck. Lena didn't wait for more. She stepped through the door, and Elias followed close behind, his mind still reeling with what they had just learned. The world they knew, the world of textbooks and historical facts, was crumbling. If they didn't stop the quantum pulse, there might not be anything left to save. It wasn't long before they were back in the lab, standing in front of the quantum pulse machine. The air hummed with electricity, the strange blue orb suspended within the glass chamber, its light flickering erratically. The machine had become an uncomfortable constant in their lives, a reminder that they were no longer part of a normal world, but one on the verge of destruction. Lena stepped to the control panel, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. I've pinpointed another fracture point, she said, her voice tight. It's coming from the early 1800s, right in the middle of Napoleon's reign. We might be able to track the initial anomaly back to that point. Elias nodded. He didn't need to hear more. They were on a clock now. Every second that passed brought them closer to the total collapse of history. Do it, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Lena pressed a final key, and the machine hummed louder, the light inside the orb growing brighter. There was a moment of absolute stillness, and then the world ripped apart. Elias's stomach lurched as the familiar modern lab dissolved into a fog of light and shadows. For an instant, he felt weightless, as though he were falling through a vortex of time itself. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to steady his breath, but it was as if time itself was pulling at him, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. When the sensation finally stopped, he opened his eyes to find himself standing on a battlefield that it wasn't a battlefield like the one he had read about in history books. This wasn't the battlefield of Waterloo. No, this was something more, something ancient. The ground was thick with mud, the air heavy with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The skies above were dark with storm clouds, and the thunder rumbled so loudly it seemed to shake the very earth beneath his feet. Around him, soldiers in brightly colored uniforms were rushing into formation, their faces hard with the resolve of men preparing for battle. Cannon fire echoed in the distance, the ground trembling with each deafening blast. Elias instinctively crouched, his heart racing as he took in his surroundings. "This is 1815, he whispered to Lena. Lena was beside him, her face set with grim determination. "It has to be. We're right in the middle of Napoleon's last stand." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The fate of the world as they knew it hung in the balance. And somewhere, on this battlefield, was the origin of the quantum pulse, the key to stopping the madness before it spread too far. But Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had already fractured history once, was still alive here. And that could mean nothing good. "We need to find the source of the anomaly," Lena said, her voice low. "It's here, Elias. This is where it all began." Elias nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The history they knew was crumbling. The world was teetering on the brink of an unimaginable collapse. And there was only one way to stop it, to find the center of the fracture and destroy the force that had torn apart time itself. Together, they moved forward into the chaos of the battlefield, not knowing what they would find, but knowing they had no choice but to keep moving forward. Time was running out and the clock was ticking.